Here we go with Chapter 18 on blood. We're going to start doing the cardiovascular system. So first we'll look at the connective tissue that is transported by the cardiovascular system, which is going to be blood. The main functions of blood being transportation. We'll look at those functions here in just a minute. And then we'll look at the heart, and we'll look at the pump for the cardiovascular system, and then we'll look at the vessels, which are arteries, veins, and capillaries. This slide lists the different functions for blood. Well, like I said earlier, it is a transportation mechanism. It's for transporting things like nutrients. Well, what kind of nutrients? Like glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids. And it's also for transporting signaling molecules. Well, what are signaling molecules? Those are things like hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers. They leave the origin, they find a target. We talked about that before this break. And then it's also for the transportation of respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. We breathe in oxygen, and then it is transported by the blood to the cells, and then the oxygen is used for aerobic respiration, and one of the byproducts of aerobic respiration would be carbon dioxide. So then the carbon dioxide is carried back to the lungs so you can exhale the carbon dioxide. And then certain waste products are going to be transported by blood. We just talked about carbon dioxide. It is a waste product. We do use some carbon dioxide in order to maintain our pH, but most of it we're going to exhale. Other waste products we'll talk about when we get to the urinary system, like urea, uric acid, stuff like that. One of the good things about this chapter is how easy it can be read and easy to understand while you're reading it. Some other chapters maybe not so much, but with blood it's pretty straightforward. So a lot of this you can read on your own. I'm just going to try to point out some of the highlights. For example, on this PowerPoint talking about the pumping of the blood, the cells of the blood cannot move on their own, so they need something to propel and move the cells. And fluids move according to a pressure gradient, and what creates the pressure gradient is the heart. Whenever the heart muscle contracts, it builds up pressure and then it pushes blood into the pulmonary and the systemic circulations. But one of the things we don't think about is this right here, talking about regulating body temperature. Heat can be carried by the plasma, by the fluid of the blood, and then the blood can carry that heat to the surface, and then that's whenever the capillaries of the skin will open up and allow heat to escape whenever the body temperature gets too high. This slide talks about how much blood do we have in our bodies. For males, it's somewhere between 5 to 6 liters. Females, it's 4 to 5 liters. So it's not uncommon for males to have up to 6 liters of blood, and for females, somewhere between 4 and 5, maybe about 4. So on average, we have about 5 liters of blood in our system. There are two parts to blood. Some of them are solid and formed particles, which are going to be the blood cells or formed elements. The other part's going to be the plasma. The plasma is the liquid portion of the blood. The blood cells include red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Now on the previous slide it talked about hematocrit, and I think it's better to show you a picture of what this is going to look like. If you draw blood, if they insert a needle into a vein, it's called venipuncture, draw some blood into a tube, and then spin that tube down in a centrifuge, this is what it's going to look like, this tube of blood. All of the formed elements that are heavier are going to go to the bottom of the tube, and then the plasma is going to go to the top of the tube. They take a measurement and they can estimate the percentage of formed elements compared to the entire tube of blood. That measurement is called the hematocrit. So in this example, the hematocrit is little less than 50%, which is normal. The white blood cells and the platelets, they form a coat on top of the red blood cells. That's called the buffy coat. So the red blood cells are going to be the heaviest. Most of the cells inside of a drop of blood or any type of blood slide are going to be red blood cells. They are heavier. They go to the bottom of the tube. The white blood cells and the platelets are going to go on top of that. It's called the buffy coat. And then the plasma, the fluid part of blood, is going to go to the top. Normally plasma should be a straw color or light yellow colored, but it can change depending on in certain types of disease processes, or even if it's a bad blood draw. If the needle stick was pretty rough and the red blood cells are ruptured as they go through the needle into the tube, then it'll cause the plasma to have a pink tint to it. And then there are some individuals whose lipids are so high that their plasma will look like milk. It'll be a whitish color and be really fatty and milky. All right, we'll start talking about plasma first. And like I said, usually it's straw colored, which is kind of a light yellow color. Most of the plasma is going to be water. That's an important thing to remember. A lot of things that can be dissolved in water, these are going to be things that are called hydrophilic substances or lipophobic substances. They are able to be dissolved in water. So the hormones and the chemical messengers that are hydrophilic that can dissolve in water, and they are transported by the plasma. The lipid-based hormones or lipid-based enzymes, they have to be carried differently because they cannot dissolve in the water of the plasma. So they're usually carried by transporter proteins. All right, so we can see the ions, we can read about the sugars and the wastes. We're going to look at the proteins here in just a minute. There are different kinds of plasma proteins, but there are three main plasma proteins we're going to look at right now. They are known as albumin, there are globulins, and then there's also fibrinogen. And we'll look at their functions. We'll look at albumin first. Albumin, let's see. If I put a little X by it or a little star maybe, albumin is going to be the most common of the plasma proteins. It's also the largest, so it's most common and largest. This is a little bit of a physiology lecture thing, but albumin is so large it creates what we call osmotic pressure. Osmotic pressure is a pressure in a liquid due to the solid particles, the solute. Osmotic pressure draws fluid towards it. So water will flow towards solutions that have a higher osmotic pressure or a higher osmolarity. So albumin has a very important function. As the fluid leaks out from the capillaries, albumin creates the osmotic pressure to bring that fluid back into the capillaries. All right, then we have the globulins, and globulins are antibodies. They're kind of a generic antibody. They're not that real specific, but they help boost your immune system. If you work in the healthcare field and you accidentally get exposed to some sort of pathogen, usually do an accidental needle stick, then they will give you a shot of gamma globulin to help boost your immune system. And then there's fibrinogen, and fibrinogen is used for blood clotting. Fibrinogen will help activate your platelets and cause a platelet plug anytime there's been damage to a blood vessel. All right, now let's look at some of the formed elements that are found in blood. First, we have erythrocytes. We'll look at what they look like here in just a second and their function. But the first part of erythrocyte means red, and then cyte means cell. So those are red blood cells. Those are erythrocytes. And then we have leukocytes. The root word leuko means white. And again, cyte means cell. So those are white blood cells. And then there are platelets. Platelets are also known as thrombocytes. So you can see that in either way. If you take a drop of blood, put it underneath a microscope and look at it, it would look like this. The most cells you're going to see are going to be these cells. They're all over the place. These are all red blood cells. Those are all the erythrocytes. They have a thin center. It's called a biconcave disc. We'll look at a picture of it later. But the red blood cells are going to be the most numerous cells in a drop of blood. And then these larger cells, like right here, and right here, and right here, those are all white blood cells. And we have two different groups of white blood cells. We have granulocytes, and then we have those cells that are called agranulocytes. If they are called granulocytes, which are going to be three of them, they have granules in the cytoplasm. If the granules stain red, then it's an eosinophil. If it stains blue or dark purple, then it's called a basophil. And then those cells that have granules that don't stain very well, those are called neutrophils. And then we have some white blood cells that don't have granules called the agranulocytes, and it's called lymphocytes and monocytes. All right, let's look at erythrocytes a little closer. Red blood cells. Red blood cells are going to be the most numerous cell that we find in a drop of blood. Whenever the red blood cell comes out of the bone marrow, they have ejected most of their organelles, and they don't have any nuclei either. They especially don't have any mitochondria, and this is the reason why. Red blood cells carry oxygen. Mitochondria use oxygen for aerobic respiration. So if the red blood cells were full of mitochondria, they'd be using the oxygen that needs to be delivered to other cells. There's no nucleus in a red blood cell and no other organelles. The main protein inside of red blood cells is called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a structure that binds to oxygen, and it's a protein structure. So if you change the shape of the hemoglobin, then you change the shape of the red blood cell, and that's called sickle cell. But anyway, each red blood cell has about 1 million hemoglobin molecules in it, and each hemoglobin can carry up to 4 molecules of oxygen. So each red blood cell can carry up to 4 million molecules of oxygen. So this is what a red blood cell looks like. It's a biconcave disc. That means it's a disc, which is round. It's not a sphere like a ball, and it caves in on the front and it caves in on the back side, which is why it's called the biconcave disc. Again, all it's going to do is carry gas. It ejects its nucleus and most other organelles so that it can carry as many hemoglobin molecules as possible. All right, let's talk about the white blood cells now. White blood cells have the ability to leave the circulation. When they get to the capillaries, they can squeeze in between the cells through the intracellular clefts, and that process is called diapedesis. So diapedesis is the process that white blood cells use to leave the circulation. They can embed themselves into tissues and become macrophages. Well, one of the macrophages we talked about in the skin are called dendritic cells. So the dendritic cells used to be a white blood cell that's in the circulation, but as soon as it left through diapedesis, it embedded itself in the skin to become the dendritic cell. White blood cells come from the bone marrow. So do red blood cells. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. Red blood cells and white blood cells, and platelets actually, both come from the bone marrow. So like the previous slide said, there are two groups of white blood cells. There are granulocytes, and then there are also agranulocytes. And then we're going to look at their functions here in just a minute. The granulocytes are known as neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Neutrophils do not stain, eosinophils stain red, basophils stain blue. The agranulocytes are known as the lymphocytes and monocytes. All right, we're going to start looking at the individual white blood cells. We'll start with the granulocytes first. We'll start with the neutrophil. If you take a tube of blood and you analyze it and you come up with a percentage of how many cells in that tube of blood are red blood cells, how many of those cells are neutrophils, so on and so forth, that's called a complete blood count with a differential. So if you take a tube of blood of a healthy individual, the most numerous white blood cell you're going to find is going to be the neutrophil. Now, the most numerous cell is going to be the erythrocyte, but we're not talking about red blood cells, we're talking about white blood cells. So the most numerous white blood cell is going to be the neutrophil. We'll look at a picture of a neutrophil in a minute, but the nucleus has many lobes to it. It has 2 to 6 lobes, and they're all connected by some sort of stalk. But a neutrophil is a macrophage. It is a small macrophage. So it's going to phagocytize, which means eats, and it destroys bacteria. So that is the main function of the neutrophil, to phagocytize and destroy bacteria. This is what a neutrophil looks like underneath the microscope. You see it has different lobes to it. There are granules in the cytoplasm, but they don't stain a particular color. And then we have eosinophils. Eosinophils have granules that stain red. And you're going to find elevated eosinophils if you have an allergic reaction and if you're fighting some sort of parasitic infection. So if you have a parasitic infection, your eosinophil count will be high, and then allergic reactions. And then when we get to basophils, you're going to see that basophils also are elevated when you have an allergic reaction. Eosinophils are going to be elevated during late stage allergic reaction because eosinophils are going to help get rid of the things that are happening to your tissues in response to allergens, which is going to be to create histamine. But anyway, eosinophils are going to be active during allergic reactions and parasitic infections. So here's a picture of the eosinophil. Usually has a bilobed nucleus attached by a stalk, and then we have all those red granules. All right, then we have basophils. Basophils are going to be the least common in a tube of blood. And sometimes it's not uncommon to find 0 basophils in a drop of blood. Basophils are also known as mast cells. And mast cells secrete two types of secretions. They secrete histamines, and they also secrete heparin. All right, histamine causes inflammation. So whenever you've been introduced to an allergen or some sort of pathogen, then basophils secrete histamine that make the capillaries really leaky and allow a lot of plasma to escape into the tissues, and it causes inflammation, which is why when you have an allergic reaction, you take an antihistamine to help get rid of that inflammation. And then heparin is an anticoagulant. So not only is it going to make the capillaries more leaky, it's also going to help prevent the blood from clotting. But basophils are used for allergic reactions. All right. This is what a basophil looks like. It has granules in it, and they stain a dark blue, maybe even a purple color. And then we have the agranulocytes, and there's 2 agranulocytes. There's lymphocytes, and then there's going to be monocytes. The lymphocytes are the smallest in size, and they are going to be used in the immune system. They are antibodies. They become the B cells and the T cells that we look at when we look at the immune system. So lymphocytes, the nucleus almost takes up the entire cell. They are the smallest of the white blood cells, and is used for immunity. It makes your antibodies. Here is the lymphocyte, and we can see the nucleus almost takes up the entire cell. The last of the blood cells, or the white blood cells, is going to be the monocytes. Monocytes are also agranulocytes, and they are the largest of the white blood cells. And they're large macrophages, which means they're going to digest large whole cells and whole particles and pathogens. So neutrophils and monocytes actually have the same function, except neutrophils are for smaller particles, monocytes are for larger particles. If a white blood cell leaves the circulation and becomes fixed into tissues, that's what the monocyte does. Here's the monocyte. If we could compare each white blood cell, you can look at that earlier in the PowerPoint. You can see that this is going to be the largest. It has a U-shaped or a kidney bean-shaped nucleus. The last of the formed elements are the platelets. And platelets actually come off of a large cell called the megakaryocyte. So there are cells that are stem cells that differentiate and become megakaryocytes in the bone marrow. And then the megakaryocyte breaks down into little tiny fragments. And those fragments are the platelets. And these platelets are also known as thrombocytes. And they function in clotting the blood. Whenever there's been damage to a blood vessel, the platelets are activated, they stick to each other, fibrinogen helps form a web, and then it clots and forms a platelet plug that plugs up the hole in the blood vessel. The term hematopoiesis means the formation of blood cells. Anytime you see poiesis at the end of a word, that means it's making or forming something. And then hemato at the first part of the word, that means blood. So hematopoiesis is the formation of blood, and it happens in the bone marrow. There are 2 types of marrow. There's red bone marrow, and then there is yellow bone marrow. So the red bone marrow It's going to be red. It makes the red blood cells and the white blood cells. It's active. It's an active marrow that's forming erythrocytes and leukocytes. We find bone marrow in spongy bone. So the trabecular pattern of the spongy bone looks like a sponge. The spaces in between the bone is where we have bone marrow. Yellow marrow is different in that it is dormant. That means it's not active. So red bone marrow, when it's not being used, it changes to an adipose fatty marrow called yellow marrow. An interesting thing is that if you ever in a predicament where you need to make more red blood cells quickly, then the yellow marrow will turn back into a red bone marrow. The last part of this PowerPoint talks about the different disorders of blood. Normally we don't talk about disorders, we just stick with normal anatomy instead of pathology. But a lot of these you hear of in the news or you read about them in the articles, and a lot of you may know somebody in your family that has one of these. So I left them in here. Same thing when we get to the heart section. You're going to know somebody that has heart disease because it is one of the most prevalent causes of death in the United States. All right, so that's it for the rest of this chapter. It's easy to read, so then we'll go over the heart chapter next.